Constable Ichabod Crane, sent from New York to investigate murder in Sleepy Hollow.
How much of your superiors explained to you?
Only that the three were slain in open ground, their heads severed.
Welcome to the latest episode of the People Will Talk podcast. Joining me, as always, is Maria.
Hello.
Last week, for our regular listeners, we had a bit of a hiccup. We had a Spanish language podcast where Maria was taking the lead, but rest assured, things are back to their normal routines today. Also joining us before Maria has a chance to respond is Roy Lotz, our special guest today, a writer, philosopher extraordinaire who's been living in Madrid for a few years. Roy, how's it going?
Pretty good. Philosopher extraordinaire, I don't know, but I'm doing well today.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here because I've had a couple of conversations with you IRL in real life, and I'm very impressed. You're very well read. I think that'll come across to our listeners today as well. And
so much pressure.
It's it's what we want to do to our guests from the get-go.
Yeah.
Just put them under pressure, make them feel uncomfortable. Now, you're from Sleepy Hollow, New York, which people, they might know it or it might ring a bell in their minds. It's very famous for a story which was subsequently turned into a movie with Johnny Depp. And it's also known, I didn't notice until I started looking into this for the interview with you, but it's also known as the place that is the most haunted place in the world. So, as a good starting point, I think, Roy, what's it like being from the most haunted place in the world?
Well, I think there's a lot of competition for that, for the most haunted place. But being from Sleepy Hollow, well, I would say it's quite nice. For one, aside from being haunted, it's actually a very nice little town. And I recommend visiting it even if you don't believe in ghosts or have any interest in scary things. It's very close to New York City, which is great. And it's in the beautiful Hudson Valley. So, but what was it like? Well, it's, we get a lot of tourists in Halloween. That's the most noticeable thing. Most of the year, it's pretty quiet. But then Halloween comes and then we get like tons of people on the train visiting the cemetery. And I live a 5-minute walk from the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, which is the main attraction, you might say. And in Halloween, well, then there's always like sort of sounds. Oh, also I live next to this forest. It's a state park, the Rockefeller State Park Preserve. And every Halloween they do a haunted hayride, which is what it sounds like, where they get a bunch of people onto a tractor, like a tractor. How would you call it? A trailer, not a tractor, pulled by a truck. And then it sort of drives very slowly through this stretch of the forest at night. And then there are, people jump out at you and scare you. Essentially, it's like a haunted house, but in the forest.
Sounds fun.
When I was a kid, it was terrifying. It was very scary.
Do you know what the genesis of the story is? Because like in Ireland, we are famous for banshees, and recently there was the Banshees of Inisherin. And banshees, you can imagine where the story comes from, because these characters, they scream, and in the dark at night, noises maybe suggest certain figures that then become solidified in our culture. But where does the whole mythos and mystique in Sleepy Hollow actually come from? Is it like oral tradition or some?
I believe the entire thing was invented almost out of whole cloth by Washington Irving, the author of the story. I don't think it has deep roots. Well, Washington Irving, I think we'll probably end up talking a lot about him, but he was really fascinated with folklore, and he was particularly fascinated with the Dutch history of New York. So New York, as you may know, was founded by the Dutch before it became an English colony. And Sleepy Hollow has a long Dutch history. In fact, in the cemetery, there are tombstones written in Dutch, which I think is pretty cool. And he was really interested in these kinds of old folk tales. But I don't believe it goes back even that far, because if I remember correctly, the headless horseman's supposed to have had his head blown off. Well, in some war, I don't even remember what war. Either in the American Revolutionary War against England, or maybe we call it the French and Indian War, which was a war of the English colonies that we fought against the French colonies with Native Americans involved.
It's the Last Mohicans, basically. The last,
Yeah.
If you've seen Last Mohicans, just for our audience, that's the conflict that movie is related to. And the French had certain Native American tribes helping them, etc. And you're right about the Dutch past, because New York was originally called New Amsterdam, right? That was the original name of. And now you do mention that we will talk about Washington Irving, because, spoiler alert, you have seen the questions, which brings us to question number 2, which is, Maria, your cue to talk about more.
Well, yes, of course, I'm always taking it to my side of things. So basically, connections to Spain, because otherwise, and monopolizes the Irish connection. So, so obviously, well, you've mentioned Washington Irving. It's the one that sort of made Sleepy Hollow famous, but as many other American writers, I guess, he had or quite a few. He had a fascination as well or he knew Spain pretty well, didn't he? Particularly Granada. Tales of the Alhambra and all this. Do you feel in any way connected to him? There's that sort of link between being American, Sleepy Hollow, Spain. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so where I'm from is obviously really dominated by Washington Irving. I think my middle school is named after Washington Irving. His house is a museum in the next town. The next town is named Irvington, so it's named after him. And of course, the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, he's buried there. So I knew all that about Washington Irving. I knew he was famous, but I actually had no idea that he had any connection to Spain before I came here. And I found that out my first year in Spain when I read Tales of the Alhambra. And it turns out that he actually spent a ton of time in Spain. I think well over 20 years. If I'm not mistaken, he was an ambassador. And so he lived in Madrid for quite a while. I do feel a connection to him. And I really enjoy seeing a statue of him, which is right outside the Alhambra in Granada. And in fact, there's a plaque in the Alhambra saying Washington Irving lived here, or something like that. So for me, that was like almost surreal to see, for me, this like epitome of my hometown being celebrated in my new home. The other interesting thing I was going to say is that his house in the United States, which is called Sunnyside, it's not particularly big, but it incorporates some architectural elements which are recognizably Spanish in a very sort of small way. So he obviously, for him, Spain was very important, and I really appreciate having that connection. Here's a fun fact. Maybe my fun facts are not very reliable, like about the Egyptian teeth, but I'm
we'll come to that. Don't worry.
When he was in Spain, he got interested in Christopher Columbus, and he wrote, I think, a really long biography of Christopher Columbus. But he was, as I said, he was really interested in like folk tales and myths, and he was not the most beholden to facts, you might say. And he's the one who invented this idea that Christopher Columbus thought that the earth was flat. It comes from his book. And of course, Christopher Columbus didn't really think the earth was flat and knew it was round. He was mistaken about the size of the earth.
Okay, that's genuinely interesting. Yeah.
Well, he invented a lot of. I mean, he's
Yeah.
related in a lot of unexpected ways to American. Well, the American holidays. I mean, Halloween, Columbus Day. He has a lot of Christmas stories. Well,
Well, no,
that's it.
it's relevant though, because I'm sure, because we don't really associate with flat earthers, we just associate
Yeah.
with good like you, Roy. But I'm assuming that they probably use Columbus as a reference, probably. You know, this
Hmm.
historical
Yeah.
figure believed this, and that gives us justification. But it shows the dangers of fake news. But however, moving from Irving to another writer, very briefly, Ray Bradbury is on record saying writing, you should do it every day, maintain it as a habit, for example, which is a very it's an introduction into your blog. Could you tell us the name of the blog, by the way?
Lots in translation. Like my last name, Lots in
Mhm.
translation. It's a pun, a bad
Um,
one.
so I like your blog, but my question really pertains to the act of writing as a daily task or a regular task. Do you need the blog, do you think, to kind of have this habit, or what's the function of the blog for you?
Well, I think it does help form the habit. Although I was writing pretty much every day before I started the blog. Although having an outlet certainly does help. I I didn't get the idea from Ray Bradbury. I actually got the idea from Stephen King, who wrote a book. In fact, I'm not the biggest Stephen King fan, but he wrote a book about writing called On Writing, very creatively. And he talks, well, he talks about his life, but he talks about the discipline of writing. And for me, that was influential. I read it when I was in university. And of course, Stephen King writes a lot. He sets uh, a word goal. He writes about 2,000 words a day. I don't normally get to 2,000 words, even on my best days. But he did instill into me the idea that you should just keep at it, and you shouldn't wait for inspiration, and you shouldn't. And really, the habit is more important than, well, than being brilliant, you might say.
You mentioned the habits. No, there are a lot of
Yeah.
people who have strange habits. Einstein slept for 10 hours a day. Da Vinci slept, I think, every 20 minutes or something, which is like birds. Birds sleep like 2 seconds every minute or something. So,
I think
but
when they're migrating, when they're
uh,
flying. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
it. Yeah. So that's that.
Yeah.
And sometimes some birds, they have the left side sleeps and then the right side sleeps, for example. They take in turns.
Yeah,
But
I do that too.
oh yeah, you switch
Yeah.
off the hemispheres of your brain. Interesting stuff.
Not intentionally.
Do you have any habits though that kind of like encompass your life as a writer or somebody who studies culture? Do you have anything that kind of is particular to you, perhaps? And
Well, actually, before I answer that, because my answer will be boring, I read a book that was very interesting. I think it was called Daily Rituals, and
Mm,
it consists of dozens of very short chapters about the daily habits of creative people, writers, but also composers and other artists. And often many of them do have quite bizarre habits. Uh, I remember, I think I'm not going to say his name so badly, Flaubert.
mhm.
Um, he would like wake up and then like knock on the floor with a cane, and then his mom would come in and bring him a coffee in bed. That's the life. I could be a famous writer if I had that routine. Um, my habits are, I don't think I have any strange habits. I basically write normally at night, after dinner, and well, my habits more pertain to reading than to writing. I pretty much write whenever I have spare time and I'm home. I try to incorporate reading into what you might call liminal spaces that you wouldn't otherwise be able to occupy. For example, when you're on the bus or on the train, I really like listening to audiobooks when I have to walk somewhere, or often when I'm running. And so I think having reading as that kind of a hobby allows me to get through many books, rather than saying, well, I have to sit down in my house right now and read this book, which I'm terrible at doing, honestly. I feel like I need to be in a bus so that there's almost nothing else I could do, and then I could read effectively.
That's quite interesting because we actually, one of the first projects that we did, isn't it? And that was an exhibition about writing that people, just things that people had written while they were, on the bus or in the
Yeah.
metro.
Scraps of paper, tickets, receipts.
Yeah, tickets, tissues. So yeah, it was quite enlightening. But we've been talking about your blog, but you've also published a book, haven't you?
Yes.
So how is that different? Well, is it different at all from like writing your blog? Obviously, you've said you have a habit of writing every day, so presumably that should help with writing a book as well. But do you follow the same process?
More or less. Often when I'm writing on my blog, it's in a way it's a lot easier because I'm either writing about a trip I took or I'm writing about a book I read, and so it's sort of, I already know more or less what I'm going to say. I just have to write it. And I think writing fiction, a lot of the time you don't quite know what you're going to say, or what's going to happen. And so in that way, it's more difficult, or more, it requires a lot more focus. And also, I have to say, I'm rather lazy when it comes to revising things for my blog. I normally read it over, I say, well, this is fine, and then I post it. But when writing fiction, I find that you have to do many drafts, and so there's a much more intense revising process for the fiction. But that's how I got into the habit of writing every day, was writing that novel. Essentially, I would come home from work. This is when I was living in Manhattan. And again, after dinner, I would write for about 2 hours. I would try to get to at least 1,000 words. So not a full Stephen King, a half Stephen King, but 1,000 words a day. Yeah, Stephen Prince, yeah, or Steve Prince, you might say. And 1,000 words a day. Most novels are about 80,000 words, give or take, a lot. Well, unless it's War and Peace. But even if you're writing 1,000 words a day, you could write War and Peace in a year and a half, right? So it's not bad.
It's impressive because our two books, I think Fake News clocked in at 40,000 something, and our novel was thereabouts like that as well. So, and all our two books so far have been very episodic, So the Fake News is a series of essays, and the novel is also kind of like short stories that are interconnected, really. So I doff my cap to writing a tome that's 80,000 words, from start to finish. It's quite impressive. Now your book also is related to philosophy, which I think marks it out as a unique book as well, because a lot of books especially people that the books that sell crime or whatever it is, or those are the books that are commonly published and produced and everything. But your book is philosophical in nature, so begging the question, what are the philosophers that maybe influence the book, or more generally speaking, who are the ones that you gravitate towards personally because they're intellectually interesting?
Well, so the genesis of the book is I had just graduated university, and I got really into philosophy just sort of on my own account, not because I had to do it for any class. And I was slowly reading through like the great Western philosophers, more or less chronologically too. So I read, Spinoza, Leibniz, Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and then I got to Immanuel Kant, and that was like very difficult for me to try to understand. And so the book was related to not any one particular philosopher as much as it was to my developing understanding of these philosophical questions. Although if I had to pick out a few who were particularly influential, I would say Immanuel Kant, just because he's so focused with the question of what can we know and why can we know it, and then I also was really taken with Wittgenstein, who is sort of probing in the same direction, but from a linguistic point of view. And in the novel, I talk a lot about how our language influences our perceptions, or our language influences the scope of our reality. And I think he has a great quote, which I should know, Wittgenstein, like the scope of my language is the scope of my reality, something like that. I should double check.
I can't remember the name of the tribe, but there's a tribe in Africa. They don't have a name for they don't have green, basically. So in a color wheel, or maybe it's blue, but in either case, whatever, if it's lots of greens and they don't have a word for blue, they can't identify the blue. But for Western people, we can identify it quite clearly. So that just bears relevance to what you said about the limits of our language is the limits of our world, because we can't enunciate it or verbalize it. It's almost, it doesn't exist mentally in us as well. But I just want to ask you a quick question about your book as well, because your novel is bringing philosophy to popular culture, essentially. And I'm sure you're aware there's like the books of The Philosophy of Batman, The Philosophy of The Office, that TV show. As someone who's philosophically minded, do you see in shows, you're watching The Sopranos or you're watching Peppa Pig, whatever it is, but you're seeing that there's actually maybe something here in the background that the writers are putting in as well, or it conforms to something that you've read from Wittgenstein? Is your brain kind of tuned to that as well a little bit?
Well, I'm not sure Peppa Pig, but sometimes when I'm reading a novel, I do have thoughts like that. Although, well, right now, for example, I'm reading a novel by Thomas Hardy, Return of the Native. And I would say most novels ultimately consist of some kind of a social criticism and are not necessarily, which, I mean, there's a philosophical aspect of that, but or an ethical aspect of it, you might say. I think a lot of shows do touch on what it means to do the right thing, which is, of course, a classic philosophical problem. And I think often, in my opinion, fiction might respond better to that question than a lot of philosophers do, because they deal with a concrete situation rather than dealing with it dealing with the most abstract principles of the situation. So in that sense, yes, socially or ethically. When I wrote my novel, I didn't deal with either of those very much, and I was very concerned more with what they call epistemology, what can we know, and how language is involved with that. I wanted to write a novel sort of like from the perspective of Descartes, where he's just in his own mind wondering what he can know.
Wow, well, now I'm gonna put you in a difficult position, because I'm gonna ask you about shows and the influence of shows, but then at the same time, in your blog, you say that you don't watch TV. So
yes.
which one is right? Do you actually watch TV, or basically, what is the reason for you to say that you don't watch TV? You don't find it particularly substantial?
Well, it's not true that I absolutely don't watch TV. For example, right now, well, it's on hold, but I've been watching The Wire with my brother, which I think is fantastic. Highly recommend The Wire. This is not news though. I watched Game of Thrones, but I was so disappointed by the last season that it made me feel extremely bitter. But I don't often watch TV. Well, partly it's because when I was in high school, I did watch a lot of TV, and before that. And in fact, I would come home and I would watch TV almost the rest of the day, and I would do my homework watching TV. And then I went to college, and it was a classic American experience where I was living in a dorm, and I don't think we had a TV, so I just couldn't. And also, I was in a new world, making all these friends, and in college is really when I started getting into reading. And I just sort of lost the habit, and I mean, it did feel like I had got the sense in college, after I learned so much in a relatively short amount of time, that I had just wasted a huge amount of time. Before that, I was like, well, what if I had been learning at a constant rate, during my childhood, rather than spending all this time playing video games and watching TV? So maybe I felt a little embittered from that experience. And as a result, it's not that I'm opposed to it in general, although, well, maybe I'm opposed to it a little bit, but it's more that I just don't have the habit of doing it. Now I do waste time in other ways. I mean, for example, I just started watching these. I go on YouTube a lot, so I can't pretend to be superior to anyone. And I've been watching these clips of expert military historians or things like that evaluating the realism of different movies. So
Oh, I watched that as well. Those are good.
it's
Yeah.
actually pretty fascinating. Turns out most movies are highly unrealistic. Big news.
And
Yeah.
you mentioned before in real life that you also watch Foil Arms and Hog, who Maria is a
Yes,
fan of
that's
as
right.
well.
Yeah,
Irish comedian, so respect for
they're
that
great.
as well.
Yeah.
And well, the YouTube thing, you're right. I mean, to be fair, the question broadly speaking is like nobody watches TV anymore. Everybody's on YouTube, so you're just part of the current zeitgeist now at the moment. You know.
Yeah, I really love watching cooking videos. That's one of my vices. Yeah.
Oh, very good. And now,
Yeah.
speaking of internet things, when we think of being an influencer, YouTube's obviously a place where people can be influencers. Instagram or TikTok doing silly dances. You are a peculiar kind of influencer. Perhaps peculiar is not the right adjective there, but you are one of the most followed reviewers on Goodreads. So
In Spain.
it's the whole
Yeah.
universe. Let's leave it at
Yeah.
that. How
Okay.
does that feel to be like this, occupying this digital space as a reference point in a platform that typically we don't think of as an influential space, but it is, of course. So, yeah, can you navigate us through that, articulate that, just tell us what it's like to be, and how you got there as well, maybe as well. Yeah.
Well, if me being a celebrity, if this counts as being a celebrity, it's the most totally obscure form of celebrity. No one has ever recognized me, or even when I told them I write reviews on Goodreads, no one has ever said, "Oh, that's you," ever. So I have zero recognition. Although, well, I got into it because I really enjoyed reading, and I wanted a space where I could share my opinions of books and read other people's opinions of books. And I discovered that it was a really great community on Goodreads. And maybe I'm not quite as much a part of the community now as before. I think a lot of people who used to use it don't use it. I mean, more people use it now than before, but I started using it before it was acquired by Amazon, and it was even more niche than now it is. Now it's become a quite common thing. And I made a lot of connections with people. For example, I made a connection with this guy named Manny, who's a computer scientist who's he's quite brilliant, and he writes hilarious reviews. And well, I've had a connection with him for years. He actually read my novel and gave me some feedback. Yeah, with this other guy named Warwick, who is a great writer, and he asked me to help edit his novel, so I did that for him. I met another person named Karen who's trying to learn Spanish and who knows German, and so I've known her for years, and I've talked to her almost every week. So basically, I got into it because it's a great community in general, and I made good connections that way. I do sometimes get messages from people who are normally self-published authors and who normally want me to read their books. And I do certainly feel for their predicament because I'm an author and I do want more people to read my books. But normally I don't do it, because if I did start reviewing people's books, I just feel like there would be no end to it. I mean, how could I select one book over another? Being a reviewer for hire, essentially.
Well, maybe
even though they don't pay me.
Maybe we could do business, because myself and Maria, we are setting up our publishers next week, literally next week. So we'll pay you. You have the profile. We have the limited funds. So
I was gonna say.
we'll do business. But yeah, the community aspect is fascinating, because I remember years ago, I think my first year in Madrid, I set up a blog which is now defunct. And I just put a poem about, it's like a funny thing about going around how to survive an art gallery. And it got picked on the front page of WordPress. And I got lots of likes on it. And then nothing after that really. But this Croatian woman who was like a human rights journalist followed me, and she would like react to my terrible blog posts after that, and we'd have like some conversations and comments and everything as well. So it's just mad who you come in touch with through like your internet presence. So it's weird and wonderful and surprising, I think.
Yeah, every so often I get a nice email from someone or other. I do sometimes get emails from people saying, "Oh, Roy, like teach me about philosophy." And I normally say, "Well, I'm really not an expert in philosophy, but there are a lot of great books you can read on the subject." For the record, I'm not an expert. Anyone who's listening to this.
We'll edit that out. We have to sell you as an
Okay.
expert to justify our podcast. No, we leave all that in. Don't worry. It's all part of the banter. But I'm sure Maria wants to come in as well with our Spain corresponding question, which we have to ask.
Well, yeah. I need to watch in every so often, just waving the flag. No, but it's interesting because it is true that for some reason there are a number of authors across the world, I would say, that maybe have had a fascination with Spain. But I think American writers, there are quite a few famous ones that have had this sort of fascination. Then again, for me as a native, is a bit of an interesting one, because to what extent, do they reflect like what for me would be real Spain? And I guess this comes from the fact that most of the time they've always been to kind of like the same places. So they tend to focus on, probably on Andalusia, and which is something we export a lot, that kind of culture, but maybe not so much. I'm from the north, by the way, so I'm not so much like, for example, in the north, beyond maybe the way, maybe Camino Santiago or something like that, but not to the same extent. There's nobody has written Tales of the Way, basically, and has become as famous as Washington Irving. But I believe you have been to all the places of Spain that are not as famous, maybe. So what is your perception? How do you feel as an American in, in Paris, I was going to say, in Spain? How does it feel for you? We've talked before a little bit about your connection with Washington Irving, but do you find an interest in these places that are perhaps not as well known? Do you think you can maybe promote them and help me in that cause of balancing it out?
Well, when I came to Spain, I have to say I was extremely ignorant about the country. Like, I've had virtually no idea what Spanish food was, and beyond the things that everyone in the world knows about, I was constantly surprised, essentially, by everywhere I went in Spain. Well, I think it's not controversial to say that Spain is quite a beautiful country. And my first couple years in the country, I was constantly surprised at virtually everything I saw. And it's true that as you said, there's sort of like this international stereotype of Spain, flamenco, bullfighting, and the Alhambra. And this is very much a stereotype of the South, as you said, of Andalusia, and it's not representative of the country as a whole. I really do enjoy visiting the north of Spain, and it does provide quite a different picture of the country. For example, the first time I went to Galicia, I was like, wow, this is like Ireland, and they're playing the bagpipes. It didn't it really didn't jive with my preconceptions of the country. But I believe it's the country with I think it's maybe number 3 in the world for the most UNESCO World Heritage sites. And there are really amazing things all over the place, in many places that you wouldn't expect. For example, one of my favorite places to visit is Mérida in Extremadura, and there's not a lot of Extremadura tourism compared to Andalusia. I mean, it's a fairly little known region, and yet there are some truly stunning things to be found. And in Mérida is very special because of the huge number of Roman ruins in that city. So you could find really interesting things all over the place, and it's certainly not just flamenco and bullfighting, although there is flamenco and bullfighting too.
Of course, and perhaps the bit that we've left, that you've got left to answer maybe is from your American point of view. How does it feel to be an American in Spain?
Well, I'd say it feels great. Although I have to say, when I was moving to Spain, my first thought as an American wasn't, I'm going to Spain and I'm going to drink sangria. My first thought was, I'm going to Europe and I'm going to have health insurance. So
Okay.
a lot of my stereotypes of Spain were joined in with my stereotypes of Europe as a whole, as a place that was not as beholden to the American dream of getting incredibly rich and driving an extremely big car. Living a more sort of I don't know if modest is the right word, a more sustainable lifestyle, and not being so totally focused on career advancement, things like that. So, and I think Spain in general conforms to that pattern, at least compared to New York, where here's one little difference. If you meet an American in America, one of the first things you ask them is, what's your job? What do you do? But in Spain, very often I would meet people and the idea, what their job wouldn't even come up in the conversation, which I found to be very shocking in my first years here. And so that was one thing I very much appreciated. Also that, people in America, you only have 2 weeks of vacation, maybe 3 if you're lucky. And so I just felt like there was a much better balance here. That was one of my big impressions.
In America, though, you could say, I'm a writer in Manhattan. That just, that's your job. That's your identity. That's one of the things you can answer to that question, and people will go, wow, he's got it. He's got it made, this kid.
Yeah.
If you say
I think if you're in Manhattan and you tell someone you're a writer, either they're going to think you're a complete loser or you're extremely successful. It depends on what you're wearing, probably. Yeah.
Well, actually, you mentioned, about when you went to Galicia and how it was similar, where you thought it was similar to Ireland. And we are always banging on about this, the connections between Ireland and Spain that historically are very relevant and very obvious, but many people don't really know about them. And not just with Galicia, just with all the points of Spain as well. So this is kind of like our little crusade to make people more aware.
What do they have in common? That they both hate the English.
That's just a minor aspect. Yeah, that's well, no, I mean, many things, like culturally, for example, myths. I mean, and I could talk about this for a long time. But yeah,
Maria, don't answer his questions. He's not the interviewer here.
Yeah.
Look, I'm just being polite. He asked me a question, so no. Basically, moving on from Spain and Ireland, because there are other places. About Africa, because you have been to Africa, haven't you? Several countries. Where have you been to exactly?
So I studied abroad in Africa. I studied in Tanzania and in Kenya, which are right next to each other in East Africa. I spent 3 months in Kenya and about a month in Tanzania. So not a huge amount of time, but some time.
Well, still more than most people.
Yeah.
So did you find any surprising links there between where you come from and...
To be honest, the historical links between East Africa and the United States, I would say, are quite limited, because Tanzania was originally a German colony. Well, not originally, but when it became a colony, when it became a state, it was first as a German colony, and then it became a British colony. So the connection to the United Kingdom is very strong historically, but to the United States, they're not deep historical connections. Their connection that I'm aware of is that I was studying paleontology in university, paleoanthropology, and of course East Africa is a hotbed of paleoanthropological research. And my university, Stony Brook University in New York, a public university, has a connection with what's called the Turkana Basin Institute, which is where I was stationed, which is in the north of Kenya, and they've been there for years. And they bring students, but also I believe it's an active research facility too, because it's in the Rift Valley, and so they're not very far from there. Richard Leakey, who is sort of like a legend in the field of anthropology, his team found Turkana boy, who I believe, which is a great specimen of, I think, Homo erectus, young boy, Homo erectus. He recently passed away, unfortunately. His wife, who I met both of them when I was studying there, and his wife is still involved in the institute, and she's great. And she recently gave a talk in my university about their research. So that's mainly what I'm aware of, is this research connection.
Yeah, well, it's a very relevant connection because
Yeah.
it's really famous, and from like the archaeology point of view, we also come across them. Now it's Richard and Mary, I think it is, no? Like,
Yeah.
And so I mean, I was thinking maybe more like from, I don't know, a cultural point of view, but that research connection is also very relevant as well.
Well, I did my honors thesis in school on East African music. And of course, there are some connections in music, mainly because American music is so popular worldwide. Although there are a lot of other influences, because, for a long time, there are also connections with what you might call the Middle East, because there are Arabian traders who would come down and trade along the coast, which is actually how the Swahili language developed, as a kind of mixture between the local Bantu languages and Arabic. So that's a major influence on some of the music in East Africa. But also there's rap, there's Swahili rap, which is pretty cool, which is obviously an American influence. So in that sense, there certainly is a connection.
Okay, well, it's been absolutely fascinating. Before we wrap up, finally, there is one small matter we have to address.
Yeah.
So in the right corner, Roy, state your case. What was this thing about Egyptians?
Okay.
So
yeah. I listened to a series of lectures by an Egyptologist named Bob Breer, who's, by the way, I highly recommend these lectures. They're very entertaining. He's a great, like, classic Brooklyn accent, because he's from the New York City. And in one of the lectures, he mentions that. Well, let me mention one other thing. I believe that he's the first person since ancient times to actually mummify a person. He and another colleague got a cadaver somehow, and they went through the process of turning it into a real mummy, and he describes that in detail. But in one of his lectures, he mentions that Egyptian bodies are often found with very worn away teeth, and his idea was that when they would be milling the bread, there was usually just sand sort of blowing everywhere, and also maybe the mill itself might have been made of sandstone, I guess, some kind of a stone that wasn't hard enough and would gradually wear away, and there would get grit and sand in the bread, which would be the main cause of the teeth erosion.
In the left corner, we have Dr. Maria Correas, Egyptologist. Your response to this?
Well, I mean, I'm not one to discredit other colleagues, but yeah, well, I've never heard of that, to my knowledge. I find it difficult to see how it would work from a physical point of view, especially coming off the mill. I really cannot see that, how it could possibly happen, because the amount would be so small, it would just be completely insignificant. In terms of sand, as in desert sand or anything, the surroundings. Again, I feel like maybe it's a bit far-fetched, and I've always seen it like related to diet and lack of calcium and other things like that in the diet and protein. But this said, I'm always willing to learn from experimental studies. So by all means, if he's into experimental studies and has done something, of well, you mentioned he'd done something to do with like mummy wrapping. So perhaps he's done something trialing, what amount of sand you would get
Yeah.
over time, and what erosion
Maybe
that
he
would
ate
cause.
sand for
Then-
several months. Nothing but sand. Yeah.
Then, well, no, but
Yeah.
I mean, well, some people do that. I
Yeah.
mean, during the pandemic, a lot of Egyptologists made Egyptian bread and other foods.
Oh yeah, well that's cool.
Yeah. So, yeah, don't knock it till you try it. So, by all means, yeah,
Yeah.
I'd be
But is
happy
it
to
true
see
that they
study.
had bad teeth?
It's definitely true that they have bad teeth. I mean,
Okay,
they
okay,
died
good.
from they died from that. And for example, here in the museum, in the archaeology museum in Madrid, where I spent many years doing tours, we have
Mhm.
mummies that people that have died from like like an abscess and
Ooh.
from that pain. So yeah, definitely really bad teeth. So sand or not,
Yeah.
they were definitely in need of dentists.
Well, I'm glad that they at least had bad teeth.
In
Hey,
6
well,
months,
okay.
Well, I'm not glad for them. I'm glad for me.
Yeah, I think we know what you mean.
Yeah.
in 6 months, but guys, you can come back, prepare your findings. Roy, you can eat
Yeah.
sand. Maria, you can make your case more watertight. 6 months, we'll have round 2 of this issue. But for the moment,
I think I only
Roy,
need 3 months of a lot of sand.
yeah, exactly. The more sand you eat, the less time you need to do the
Yeah.
diet. But honestly, Roy, it's been great having you here. You've been so generous with your time. Enjoy the rest of your weekends. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had a great time.
Thank you, Roy.